will almost always choose for their first playthrough the good option. I don't want to do the right thing. I want to do the selfish thing. We can choose to mouth off to the big bad guy character without having to worry about being physically battered.
I hate hand movements in video games.
We're really good at the uncanny right now. It could promote the perception that it's something else entirely.
Okay, but let's say you want to create a humanoid character in a video game. And there are different types of character customization tools, as for example, Cyberpunk has an extremely versatile character creation tool compared to like older games, like maybe Oblivion. It's like one of the examples where I really struggled to create a character I like because the customization tool was so limited. But would you argue that progressing with the technologies and like the possibility of face scans and stuff, would you argue that you being able to create a character that looks almost like you, let's say almost, not exactly, would this help the character identification, or would it actually at some point reach like some sort of uncanny valley where the character would almost look like you, but not quite, and then this throws you off?
I think that both are good possibilities. As far as the potentials for identification, absolutely. The more realistic it looks, the more sort of socially and perceptually real it looks, there is the potential to see it more as being like yourself, as you know yourself in everyday life, right? But there's also the possibility that if we hit some sort of reality threshold or realism threshold, it's also possible that it could promote the perception that it's something else entirely, right? Notwithstanding the uncanny valley, just more like, oh, well, that looks real in its own right. But you raise a good point about the uncanny, right? This feeling of it's getting there, but it's not quite right. We know that, especially, for instance, with robots, we're really good at the uncanny right now, despite our best efforts to create very realistic robots. I wonder if we are in a similar position now with so many different kinds of gaming technologies, but we've also got some that are, again, we were talking about it last night, Cyberpunk. Some of those characters, the depth of their eyes and sort of the textures of their skins are so convincing in many cases that we may have in some cases passed the uncanny, and we may be on sort of the lower edge of the uncanny or smack in the middle of it in some cases. But remember that the way we think about anthropomorphism, it is in part the visuals, but also how they move and the types of behaviors that they do, right? And we have a problem with game AI in a sense, as far as the development resources and time that it takes to develop characters that can give us realistic sounding conversations that aren't the same, or at least one of the same 5 rotations every single time. That starts to become a little bit of a challenge, right? If we are to get to that point where it feels really real, either as ourselves or as someone else, we have a lot of barriers to cross over. So the idea of the uncanny being sort of a risk of these attempts to make things highly customizable and highly realistic is certainly a consideration.
I really like the point that you were making about optimizing the way characters have conversations with us or with each others, because something that really throws me off when playing video games is hand movements. I hate hand movements in video games. Like in most video games, the characters do some sort of gestic movements and stuff, but they don't really involve their hands in it. They just move their arms, and their hands are just extensions of their arms, and that's just not realistic. And,
that's a great example.
Okay, then let's talk about the embodiment. Do you think when the amount of control we have over a virtual avatar increases, like in games like Human Fall Flat, where you can move the limbs of the character individually, do you think this increases the amount of embodiment, or is there like a breaking point where this just destroys the embodiment because it feels so unrealistic how you move?
This is an amazing question. And it's one that, to be frank, I wouldn't have really thought about, but I think there's a couple of important points. Keep in mind the actual complexity and versatility, as you use those two words, of the controls can be different than the complexity and versatility that is experienced by the player. Let's say that someone is more skillful in sort of just hand dexterity, right? They bring that in versus me, who's very awkward. And they are probably going to be more successful in their controls and feel, and what we measure in these scales is the feeling of control, not even the actual control, right? Just feeling as though you have control over it. I would suggest that these feelings of control, it's helpful to think about it in terms of flow theory, right? That if we have too much control or feel like we're too much in control, that could lead to boredom, right? Because the skill isn't, or the challenge isn't necessarily matching our skill set, right? If we feel out of control, that can be very, very frustrating. And so we might need to hit that sweet spot in terms of control in order to feel like, like it is challenging enough, but not too challenging. Right. As far as the specific question around increased control and critical concern, I actually had to go back into our data. And so this is one that you may not have read. It's the CPAX scale project. That is where we took our PAX scale and updated it and translated it into traditional Chinese and German. And what we found in that data set was that there is no correspondence between sense of control and critical concern. So they seem to have little to do with each other in people's subjective experience, but that could still go a different way if we're talking about actual control or lack of control. But remember, critical concern is very much about it's more about the cohesiveness of the world, right? And the character's place in the world. So it could be that if things are too complicated, they don't even pay attention, right? They don't even pay attention to the world or the place in it. They're just trying to get by. And a really useful model for this is Nick Bowman's video game demand, where there's 4 or 5, depending on how you look at it, different dimensions of the demand that video game places on us, where if one is too high, right, if the physical controls or the cognitive work required to actually do the complex controls is too high, our ability to engage things like the narrative might suffer. So I think it's a possibility for sure.
That's more than I could have hoped for, because I just thought of controls like physical inputs, like button inputs, not like the subjective feeling of control we have over the character. Is there something you wanted to add at this point? Something we have not managed to think about, something that you found to be interesting to talk about that we didn't mention in our questions?
Oh, let's see here. There was much more honestly interesting in your questions. I think one important thing to remember in all of this is that player-avatar relations are subjective, right? They are the phenomenological component of the interactivity between me and the character. They're also relational. That is, they can develop or do inherently develop over time. We may have sort of a predispositioned orientation toward game characters broadly, but the relationship may unfold differently, just like it would with a person, right? You and I, you might have been nervous or unsure or critical when we started this conversation today, but we have now unfolded a bit of a relationship, as short as it may be, right? And we may have a different understanding of each other in this moment than when we came in.
Okay, let's talk about perspective taking for a moment. So in recent years, there have been plenty of adventure video games in the style of like Telltale games. And these games like have very minimalistic gameplay. These mainly focus on making moral decisions with the characters inside the video game. Why do you think these games are popular, like in general, but also nowadays, especially?
I would say they're popular for the same reason that other types of narrative media are popular, right? We enjoy engaging in alternate possibilities. And as far as sort of the high narrative and decision making, we have the benefit of being able to make those choices without suffering repercussions in any sense with more gravity, I guess, right? We can choose to mouth off to the big bad guy character instead of be polite without having to worry about being physically battered. But as far as what those types of games offer that other types of media don't, I enjoy the self-determination theory perspective. We engage different types of media based on their ability to help us satisfy our needs for autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And when it comes to making those moral choices, we, especially autonomy and competence, right? I think they play quite a bit of a role here. Where autonomy, we don't have, if we're feeling like we are not autonomous in our daily life, right? It's like, I don't want to do the right thing. I want to do the selfish thing, right? We can make that selfish choice in a game and it's okay, right? Because that makes sense within the rules of both the ludic system and sometimes in the narrative system. And as far as competence goes, that's sort of a little bit of a different spin on moral decision-making in games. I don't know about you, but usually as you start to make those decisions in the game, you can start to figure out how the game is treating you based on the decisions you make.
Yeah.
So you can have particular types of goals as a gamer and start to figure out ways to make decisions that are not moral or immoral. As Nick Bowman says, they're more amoral, right? It's you're not treating them as moral. They then become a fun tool to play with in order to advance your goals in gameplay. There's some evidence to suggest that in games where you can basically choose, let's say Star Wars, the dark side, right? Or not. People will usually, if you have good and evil options, people will almost always choose for their first playthrough the good option, right? Because they feel like the game is probably going to punish them for making an evil choice, when the game is literally designed to give you both pathways.
Yeah.
But then often if it's a game that you can play through multiple times, they will go back and choose the evil path later.
We were talking about the subjective experience while playing League of Legends earlier. And I want to get back to the avatar's object relationship type. And as we already said, like games that are played more like work, subjectively,
clarification.
then these tend to foster avatar's object identification. What happens when like a series like Arcane comes along? There always has been some sort of backstory to League of Legends characters, but it just felt like, yeah, they needed some sort of story to tell. So they added these little text snippets, well, because that's what they were back in the day. But now there's like a whole Netflix series about telling the stories of the characters that you play in game. Right. But what happens to the avatar character relationship once you add these backstories?
The limited evidence that I have would suggest that wrapping the narrative around it would make it sort of the relation move more toward the social end of the spectrum, you know, as far as imbuing the character with motivations and tendencies and habits and things like this. Narrative is core to how we understand the world. When we don't understand something, we craft a story to try to explain it, to try to cope with it, to try to predict somebody else's behavior, and to try to plan our own behavior.
Would you say the game becomes more accessible for like casual gamers by these series and backstories, because the game somewhat loses the characteristic of being so competitive?
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting question. I don't know. I would say it would depend on how the game community more broadly might be engaging it, because I'll tell you, I don't play League of Legends. I don't like PvP because people are mean. And so if I knew that everybody was going to start, sort of taking up the narrative component of it, and somehow that would be combined with more pro-social behavior, then maybe I would. Maybe I would perceive it to be more accessible to me as someone who doesn't want to engage toxic gaming behavior.
In the text, you said that most players having an avatar as me connection want to play a character that kind of resembles themselves. It's like an extension of the self. Mm-hmm. And in connection to number 3, where we talked about the character creation possibilities or like the tools, does the avatar-as-me relationship suffer if we play like pre-generated characters, like, for example, Geralt in the Witcher universe or Arthur Morgan in Red Dead Redemption, in comparison to when we play characters that we created ourselves, like V in Cyberpunk?
Right. Some data out there would suggest that assumption is correct, that the potential for identification goes down as we remove the ability to customize. But I will say that players are pretty resilient and clever when it comes to how they can find meaning in their connection with their character. I'm going to go back to some of my early interviews with WoW players. Sometimes it's very literal in terms of how players customize, right? One guy was like a forestry biology researcher, and he researched this particular kind of owl in his everyday life. And so he played a hunter in the game and had an owl combat pet. But then there are people who are like, I don't see any bit of me here, so I'm actually going to take up metaphors. There's one guy who saw himself as very anti-establishment, very punk. And so he made an undead warlock, which he felt both of those things sort of symbolized going against the man. And so to him, even though there wasn't like formal anti-establishment narrative wrapped around those, he was able to pick out different symbols that worked for him. And there were a lot of people that did that, to where I suspect that if a person really feels like in order to engage a game or over time starts to feel like they are highly identified with their character, there has probably been some kind of adaptive meaning making, right?